Yeah. Ringo Starkey doesn't really work. Ringo Starr.
For millions of fans around the world, Ringo Starr is the lovable, peace-promoting drummer of the Beatles, a man whose cheerful humor and laid-back charm helped define the spirit of the 1960s. He's remembered for his easygoing personality, his steady rhythm, and his signature phrase, peace and love. But behind that calm exterior, Ringo Starr has always had opinions, strong ones, especially when it comes to the world of rock and roll. Over the decades, he's been remarkably open about his dislikes, frustrations, and even grudges within the music industry. While Ringo has often been seen as the quiet Beatle, those close to him know he's never been afraid to say exactly what he thinks when something rubs him the wrong way. Throughout his career, Ringo has encountered countless bands who, in his view, either lacked authenticity, disrespected the Beatles' legacy, or simply made noise without soul. In interviews, documentaries, and even backstage moments caught on camera, he occasionally revealed which artists failed to impress him, and sometimes, which ones he outright couldn't stand. From the punk bands that mocked the Beatles' clean-cut image, to modern acts that Ringo felt forgot what music was really about, his list of most hated bands spans generations. So today, we're diving into that rarely discussed side of Ringo Starr, the man behind the drum kit, the legend who kept the Beatles in rhythm, and the few bands that truly got under his skin. Before Ringo Starr became one of the most recognizable drummers in history, he was just Richard Starkey, a working-class kid from Liverpool with big dreams and a set of sticks. He joined the Beatles in 1962, completing the lineup that would change music forever. His steady, no-nonsense drumming gave the band its backbone, while his humor kept tensions low when fame became overwhelming. For millions, Ringo was the funny Beatle, the easygoing one, the glue that held the group together. But what many fans didn't realize was that behind the laughter, Ringo had a sharp sense of what he liked and what he didn't. He valued musicianship, sincerity, and originality. And when other bands failed to meet those standards, he wasn't shy about saying so. When the Beatles broke up in 1970, Ringo embarked on a solo career, recording hits like Photograph and It Don't Come Easy. He became an elder statesman of rock, respected but also unfiltered. In interviews over the years, Ringo made it clear that not all rock acts earned his approval. Some, he felt, were trying too hard to copy what the Beatles had already done. Others, he thought, had forgotten what real music was. And the first band on his unofficial most hated list proved that Ringo wasn't afraid to speak his mind, even about acts that achieved massive fame. In the 1990s, British rock was dominated by one word, Britpop. And at the center of it all were Oasis, fronted by the fiery Gallagher brothers, Liam and Noel. They idolized the Beatles, dressed like them, sounded like them, and even claimed to be their spiritual successors. But for Ringo Starr, that admiration felt more like imitation. He once remarked in an interview that Oasis talked a good game but didn't back it up with anything new. He found their arrogance off-putting and thought their constant comparisons to the Beatles were disrespectful to the band's legacy. Ringo respected confidence but not ego. To him, Oasis represented a generation of musicians who mistook loudness for talent and controversy for artistry. While other former Beatles, like Paul McCartney, occasionally praised Oasis for reviving British guitar music, Ringo stayed cool, never impressed, never swayed. There were also deeper reasons. Oasis often used the Beatles' name to boost their own reputation, calling themselves the next great band from Liverpool, even though they weren't from Liverpool at all. That irritated Ringo, who saw it as empty showmanship rather than sincerity. Ringo's dislike wasn't venomous. He rarely held grudges, but it was clear. When asked once whether he thought Oasis compared to the Beatles, Ringo chuckled and said, "They're fine lads, but they're no Beatles." That one line said it all. For Ringo Starr, authenticity mattered more than hype. And Oasis, no matter how successful, would never measure up to the real thing. Ringo Starr has always carried himself with an easy charm, rarely angry, never bitter. But if you listened closely to his interviews over the years, you could tell when a band rubbed him the wrong way. Ringo believed that rock music should come from the heart, not from ego, excess, or empty rebellion. And two particular bands, known for their wild antics and inflated self-importance, pushed Ringo's patience to the limit. During the late 1980s, when Guns N' Roses exploded onto the scene with appetite for destruction, Ringo Starr was already an established legend, a man who'd seen the highs and lows of fame decades before. At first, he was impressed by their energy. But as time went on, Ringo's respect turned into frustration. He disliked what he called manufactured chaos. In his eyes, Guns N' Roses had taken the rebellious spirit of early rock and roll and turned it into a circus. Their backstage fights, public feuds, and wild behavior reminded him of everything the Beatles had worked hard not to be. Ringo once commented that the band forgot the music in the madness. To him, Axl Rose's unpredictable temper and the group's endless controversies overshadowed their talent. The Beatles had also been rebellious, but their defiance came through creativity, not destruction. It wasn't just about image, either. Ringo was unimpressed with the way the band treated their fans. Late shows, walkouts, and canceled concerts offended his deep sense of professionalism. As a lifelong performer who prided himself on respect for audiences, Ringo found that kind of behavior unforgivable. To him, Guns N' Roses were a warning, proof that fame without discipline eventually destroys the music. If there was one band that perfectly symbolized the side of rock Ringo despised, it was the Sex Pistols. Loud, chaotic, and aggressively anti-establishment, they tore through the late 1970s with an attitude that horrified traditional musicians, and Ringo was no exception. While he respected the right of young artists to express frustration, he thought the Sex Pistols took it too far. To him, punk wasn't about rebellion, it was about noise. He once said in an interview that the Pistols didn't play music, they played mayhem. Ringo came from a generation of musicians who learned their craft through hard work and constant gigging. The Sex Pistols, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on controversy more than talent. Their crude lyrics, reckless performances, and open disdain for the music industry left Ringo unimpressed. When asked in the early 1980s what he thought of punk, Ringo simply smiled and said, "I don't." It was a gentle but unmistakable dismissal. To Ringo, the Sex Pistols weren't the voice of a generation. They were proof that the art of songwriting was losing its meaning. The Beatles had once symbolized change, but it was thoughtful, creative change. The Sex Pistols, in his eyes, stood for destruction without purpose. By the time the 1980s and 90s rolled around, Ringo Starr had lived through every musical revolution, from the British invasion he helped start, to the rise of heavy metal, punk, and grunge. But through it all, he kept the same belief. Music should have soul, melody, and meaning. Ringo loved rhythm, loved groove, and appreciated artists who respected the roots of rock and roll. But when certain bands abandoned melody for volume, or traded emotion for shock value, Ringo quietly checked out. And sometimes, not so quietly, when Metallica stormed onto the scene with their fierce, thrash-heavy sound, they became the face of a new generation of heavy metal. Fans praised their intensity and dark storytelling. But for Ringo Starr, it was all just too much. He respected musicianship. And he acknowledged the band's technical ability, but he couldn't stand the unrelenting aggression of their music. Ringo once joked that Metallica sounded like a car crash set to a drum beat. He believed that music should move people emotionally, not just overwhelm them with noise. Ringo, who spent decades crafting songs with melody and harmony, found Metallica's approach exhausting. He disliked the way modern metal bands prioritize speed and power over feeling. To him, the art of a great song was in its simplicity, and Metallica's long, complex riffs and dark themes felt like overkill. In interviews, Ringo also expressed confusion over why audiences seemed drawn to such intensity. "Music's supposed to make you feel good," he said once, "not make you want to fight someone." That line summed up his stance perfectly. Ringo wasn't angry, just disappointed. To him, the beauty of rock had been buried under distortion and rage. When grunge took over the early 1990s, the music industry once again changed overnight. Nirvana became the voice of a generation, with Kurt Cobain leading the charge against the glossy pop of the 80s. Critics loved them, fans worshipped them. But Ringo Starr? Not so much. He didn't hate Nirvana as people. In fact, he once called Kurt Cobain a talented, lost soul. What Ringo couldn't stand was what Nirvana's success represented, the death of melody in mainstream music. For Ringo, the rawness of grunge was difficult to appreciate. The sloppy guitars, mumbled lyrics, and anti-establishment attitude felt alien to someone who built his career on tight arrangements and careful production. He often said that Nirvana's sound reminded him of a rehearsal, not a record. He also struggled with the darkness of their lyrics. The Beatles had written about love, hope, and self-discovery. Nirvana's songs were filled with pain, anger, and self-destruction. Ringo, who valued positivity and peace, found it hard to connect with that level of despair. While he respected Kurt Cobain's artistry, he never embraced the grunge movement as a whole. To him, Nirvana symbolized a shift away from craftsmanship, a moment when music stopped trying to inspire joy and started reflecting chaos. As Ringo Starr entered the later chapters of his life and career, he became known not just as the Beatles' drummer, but as one of the most grounded, genuine figures in rock history. Unlike many of his peers, Ringo never chased trends, never pretended to like something just because it was popular, and never shied away from speaking his mind. And even in the 2000s and 2010s, decades after the Beatles had disbanded, there was still one band that got under his skin. It wasn't a wild metal act or a punk group. It was a pop-rock band that Ringo felt represented everything wrong with modern music's obsession with fame over feeling. To most of the world, Coldplay is one of the biggest and most beloved bands of the 21st century. Their soaring melodies and emotional lyrics have filled stadiums for over 2 decades. But for Ringo Starr, that success always came with an asterisk. He respected Chris Martin's songwriting skills, but found the band's music too polished, too predictable, and too safe. Ringo believed that true rock and roll was supposed to surprise people. Coldplay, to him, was a product of an industry that had become too careful, too corporate, and too afraid to take risks. In one conversation during the 2010s, Ringo was asked about modern rock bands. He sighed and said, "Everyone's trying to sound like Coldplay. That's the problem." It wasn't a compliment. It was a lament. He missed the days when bands had their own voice, their own quirks, their own energy. To him, Coldplay's sound was pleasant but empty, a perfect reflection of a musical era obsessed with production over passion. Ringo never meant his comments cruelly. He simply couldn't pretend to feel inspired by something he saw as formulaic. "Give me a band that sounds like people," he once said, "not computers." Over the years, Ringo Starr's hate list became less about bitterness and more about principle. The bands he criticized, Oasis, Guns N' Roses, the Sex Pistols, Metallica, Nirvana, and Coldplay, all stood for something that, in his eyes, had lost touch with the heart of real music. But what made Ringo special wasn't just his honesty. It was his refusal to become cynical. Even when he disliked an artist's sound or attitude, he still encouraged young musicians to play, to create, and to love what they do. His motto, peace and love, wasn't just a catchphrase. It was how he survived an industry that often thrived on conflict. Ironically, many of the bands he disliked admired him deeply. Members of Metallica, Nirvana, and Oasis all cited the Beatles as one of their biggest inspirations. Whether he liked their music or not, Ringo's influence was undeniable. In the end, his honesty only strengthened his legend. Ringo Starr never pretended to be a rock philosopher or a critic. He was simply a drummer who loved real songs, real people, and real passion. And even if he didn't love every new sound that came after the Beatles, he remained one of the few musicians who never forgot where the beat truly came from. Because for Ringo, the truth was simple. Trends fade, but rhythm lasts forever.